Welcome to Quarantine History of Otter Tail County. I'm Chris Schulke from the Otter Tail County Historical Society. Today is our third and final series on the Cutlerites and the forming of Clitherall, Otter Tail County's first permanent settlement. Well, as the Cutlerites were felling trees for their new homes in west central Minnesota in the summer of 1865, Sylvester Whiting noticed that the bark had been cut and then partially grown back from a spot on one tree. Curious, he pried off the bark to find the word Clitherall carved into the wood. Without knowing its context, the Cutlerites saw this as a sign from God and decided to give that name to their community, Clitherall. Well, born on June 13, 1814 at Fort Johnson, North Carolina, George Bush Burgwin Clitherall was the grandson of two well-to-do Southern families. One of them, in fact, was a Tory sympathizer. His paternal grandfather, Dr. John Clitherall, signed a letter of congratulations to British General Cornwallis following the British victory at Camden. He also served as medical doctor for British troops. Clitherall's maternal grandfather, while a supporter of the Revolution, had strong business connections with England. In fact, his home in Wilmington, North Carolina was used by General Cornwallis for his headquarters. Cornwallis stayed in the Burgwin home for 3 weeks before his final defeat at Yorktown. Regardless of the family's lofty status, Clitherall's father, who was a United States Army officer, was characterized as a scoundrel who often displayed behavior unbecoming that of an officer. On one occasion in Charleston, South Carolina, the Clitherall was observed driving around a racetrack in a coach in the company of several young women. Another time, he was attending a formal concert when, in full dress uniform, drunkenly pushed his way to the front of the concert hall, climbed on stage, and seated himself in front of the performer. Well, the elder Clitherall's antics resulted in a general court-martial where he was demoted. Well, despite her husband's numerous scandals, George's mother, Eliza, was determined to get her son an appointment at West Point. And she did this as he was admitted in 1832, despite obvious shortcomings. In fact, after just 4 months, George was discharged due to deficiencies in mathematics and French. And for the rest of his life, Clitherall very carefully referred to his time at West Point. Well, after he was kicked out of the academy, Clitherall married Sally Ann Forbes. They had one daughter, Elizabeth, and then they moved to Mobile, Alabama. Now, in Mobile, Clitherall became a founding member of the Mobile Rifle Company, which was basically a local militia group. Since they were not affiliated with the United States military, their record is quite vague. We do know that Clitherall referred to himself as Major. In 1857, Clitherall received an appointment from President James Buchanan to serve as agent at the United States Land Office in Otter Tail City. Joining Clitherall was William Sawyer, another Southerner and a Buchanan appointee. So Clitherall, his wife, and daughter moved to St. Paul in 1858, living at the American House Hotel on the corner of 3rd and Exchange Streets. During his tenure in Minnesota, Clitherall split his time between Otter Tail City and St. Paul. Now, according to St. Cloud State professor Christopher P. Lehman, Clitherall was one of 3 slaveholders appointed by President Buchanan to federal positions in Minnesota Territory. In 1840, the federal census indicates that George B. Clitherall owned 4 male and 4 female slaves in Greene County, Alabama. 10 years later, the family had relocated to Mobile, Alabama, and according to census records, Clitherall owned 3 male and 3 female slaves. On March 6, 1857, 2 days after Buchanan's inauguration, the Supreme Court, in what became known as the Dred Scott decision, held that the federal government had no power to regulate slavery in federal territories acquired after the creation of the United States. This landmark case essentially legalized slavery in all territories, including Minnesota Territory. In his paper, A Slaveholding Confederate in Otter Tail County, Lehman concludes that President Buchanan had a vested interest in the verdict, as his vice president, John Breckinridge, was also a Southern slaveholder who owned real estate in Minnesota Territory. As a result of the Dred Scott decision, the legalization of slavery created the potential for Southerners to invest in Minnesota Territory, and they did not have to leave their slaves behind in the South. President Buchanan's appointment seemed to encourage such transactions. In addition to Clitherall, he chose a slaveholder from South Carolina to head the land office in Stillwater, and one from Virginia for receiver of public monies in Sauk Rapids. Now, in 3 years that Clitherall served as Otter Tail's land agent, there is no official documentation that he owned slaves while here. The 1860 census lists Clitherall and his wife Sally Ann as being born in North Carolina, and their daughter Elizabeth in Alabama. Now, there is speculation that a servant in the household named John Battle came with them from Alabama. The census, however, does not designate his color as B for black or M for mulatto. So Southern slave-owning political appointees in Minnesota Territory led to suspicions they were pro-slavery Southern Democrats fronting a land syndicate that favored Southern buyers. In fact, early Fergus Falls investor George B. Wright had his suspicions as he labeled Clitherall and Sawyer a couple of high-toned pro-slavery gentlemen of the good old days of James Buchanan. While there is no direct proof that George B. Clitherall and William Sawyer were part of a Southern land syndicate whose goal was to make Minnesota a slave state, they did in fact acquire large tracts of land in Anoka, Pine, Chisago, and Sherburne counties. Well, all these suspicions really became moot when Confederate forces bombarded Union soldiers at Fort Sumter, South Carolina on April 12, 1861, thus starting the American Civil War. 2 months later, Clitherall returned to Alabama, where he once again became active in the Mobile Home Guard. Despite his Southern connections, George B. Clitherall retained fond memories for Minnesota. The March 11, 1890 St. Paul Pioneer Press records that he donated a chair that had supposedly belonged to George Washington and was once used in the Mount Vernon Library to the Minnesota Historical Society. The Historical Society at that time responded with a handsomely engraved resolution of thanks signed by Henry M. Rice and Charles E. Flandreau. Several weeks later, George Clitherall died on October 21st, 1890. So the question, of course, begs, what did the Cutlerites think about naming their community after a pro-slavery Southerner? In her book, Obscure Believers, The Mormon Schism of Alpheus Cutler, Billoween Whiting Young speculates that it is possible they had heard of George B. Clitherall earlier because of his land office position. But it is unlikely that they would have named their village after him if they had known that he was a slave-owning Confederate sympathizer. In looking back at the founding of their home, second-generation Cutlerites confirmed that view. In the old Clitherall storybook, Hallie Gould, the daughter of Winfield and Ella Whiting Gould, summarized the prevailing feeling. She wrote, "How we wish these early homemakers had been the ones to give this lake and town its name. We wish they had given it a name they particularly loved and revered because of some memory or past association. This would have given it an added fascination for those of us who love the place partly for our forefathers' sake." Now, recent years have seen the removal of statues, markers, flags, and other symbols of the Confederacy, primarily in southern states. Minnesota renounced its own Confederate ties really from the very beginning of statehood. Initially, the new state had counties named after Southern congressmen such as John Breckinridge, Jefferson Davis, and Robert Toombs. When all three of them left Congress to join the Confederacy in 1861, Minnesota renamed the counties soon after the Civil War began. Yet, in Otter Tail County, we have a township, lake, and community named after a slave-owning individual who supported the Confederacy. So a debate which has not taken place is whether we should retain the name Clitherall or follow the state's long tradition of removing the names of such people from Minnesota locations. Well, that's it for this edition of Quarantine History of Otter Tail County. We'll be back next week with another fascinating look at Otter Tail County history. I'm Chris Schulke. Thank you for joining us, and don't forget to subscribe and support the Otter Tail County Historical Society.